Have you ever experienced the feelings of feeling unseen or resentful in your relationships because your boundaries are weak? Or have you ever felt taken advantage of because of weak boundaries? Do you often find yourself saying yes when what you really want to say is no? In my book, Free to Be, A Pathway to Inner Liberation, I have a chapter where I title it The Inability to Say No. If you're listening to this podcast, Masks Off for People Pleasers and Perfectionists, I can pretty much say that you struggle with setting boundaries, you have a hard time saying no, and you say yes when what you really want to say is no because you have people pleasing tendencies. So I'm going to share with you what I write in my book on this chapter. Then we're going to dive in and talk about tools that you can start to implement if you are stuck in this people pleasing, lack of boundary setting prison, and how you can have more paradise. So I share in my book that for many of us, the most difficult word to say is no. It's one of the shortest, simplest words, but for a people pleaser, it is one of the most difficult words to say. I invite you to try to say no. It's simple, but yet you have felt and you know that it can be so hard to say no. And here's why I say it. The reason it's so hard to say is that we are afraid people won't like us if we deny their requests. And then we have to deal with our guilt over disappointing them. That's the key. We don't want to feel those guilty feelings for having said no. We may have been raised and conditioned to believe that a good employee, child, parent, spouse, or friend never says no. When I was growing up, my mom always reminded my sister and I that Jesus put others ahead of himself. This conditioned me to believe that I was being selfish whenever I put myself first. If I wasn't putting other people's needs ahead of my own, then I was being selfish in some way. But every time I said yes, when I really wanted to say no, I felt so crappy. Subconsciously, I knew that I was betraying myself. And that caused me to suffer anxiety from depression and poor self worth. Because I was so tired of feeling crappy on the inside, I decided to take a stand and assert myself by saying no to something that would potentially upset others. This particular story I share in the book is that when my kids were young, they were attending Catholic school and we were raising my kids to be Catholic. I was raised Catholic, my husband was raised Catholic. I decided that I no longer wanted to be a practicing Catholic. As you can imagine, this was a really big deal. And I had so much angst over this decision. It just tore me up inside. For the longest time, I knew in my heart that it wasn't where I belonged. I knew both my husband and my mom would be upset if I stopped going and if I didn't force my kids to go as well. Like, how dare you not raise them Catholic? You can't stop you can't do that. You have to raise them Catholic. They have to be raised Catholic. So every Sunday I would sit in church and I stew. I didn't want to be there. I didn't feel that I belonged. My heart was not in it. And I wanted to take a stand and say that I was no longer going to be a practicing Catholic. As I expected, when I mentioned to my husband that I was considering leaving the church, he was upset with me. And it's incredibly difficult for a people pleaser to have anyone be upset with them. As you know, if you're listening to this episode and you have people pleasing tendencies, you're choosing to listen to this podcast because you have, on some level, people pleasing tendencies. So you can relate to what I'm saying, that it's incredibly difficult to have others be upset with you. And this is what keeps you or me from asserting ourselves and speaking up and setting a boundary. As difficult as it was for me to declare that I was no longer going to attend church, it did on some level feel great once I made that decision. It took a lot of internal coaching to follow through on this decision because so many times I was ready to backpedal and I'm like, it's just 1 hour a week. It's not a big deal. Why don't I just go? It's good for the kids. But it felt so good because it was an act of me standing up for myself and being true to me and what I felt and believed in my heart. Even though I made this one decision many years ago, I still had a long road ahead of me before I could finally claim freedom from the guilt I once felt from saying no to others, especially my mom, my husband, or even my kids. But this was a big victory for me. So I ask you some questions in the chapter, and I'm curious as I wrote this, and I'm asking you verbally now, that anytime someone asks you to do something for them, can you take a moment and really evaluate your feelings? Like, really look at your feelings. And this is part of the tool or the step that you can start to implement in terms of overcoming people pleasing tendencies or the inability to say no, or AKA setting a boundary. Hey, it's Kim here, interrupting your regularly scheduled podcast episode to let you know about an opportunity to go deeper into this work. I invite you to head over to Amazon.com and pick up your copy of my book, Free to Be: A Pathway to Inner Liberation. If you are looking to unhook from people pleasing and perfectionistic patterns, if you're looking to have a better way of identifying your patterns and then how you can unhook so you can be free to step outside your comfort zone, free to have more meaningful relationships in your life, free to be your true self without hiding behind a mask any longer. If you desire any of this, then I encourage you to pick up your copy. And if you enjoy my book as much as I loved writing it, please go on over and leave a review on Amazon. You can leave a star review or written review. Now back to your regularly scheduled podcast episode. So you check in with yourself, you evaluate. Is this something that you are truly willing and wanting to do, to say yes to someone else's request? If the person is asking you over and over again and they don't reciprocate, it's very possible that they are picking up on your energy, that they know you're going to say yes and you won't say no. So they're taking advantage of you. And if they're taking advantage of you, then over time, it's inevitable that you will feel resentful for being taken advantage of. Maybe it is a family member, maybe it's your boss, and they just know that you're almost always going to say yes. It's a pattern and it's this dance that they do with you, and you are just so tired of always saying yes. So begin to identify what it feels like in your body when you say yes and you really want to say no? Do you feel like a tightness in your chest? Do you feel that your shoulders kind of come forward and you're bent over? Do you feel even a nauseous feeling in your stomach because you just know in your heart of hearts that you don't want to do this thing that this person is asking you to do? And yet you don't have the courage to actually say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do this. So you might feel some nauseousness in your stomach. You might feel a pit in your stomach. You might feel heaviness in your shoulders or in your chest. And then you can ask yourself the question, why do you think you struggle so much to say no to this particular person or anyone really? It could be you have a hard time saying no to everybody. And that was me for a long time. Why are you afraid to say no? Are you afraid that you might be rejected? Do you feel like you might get yelled at or manipulated or ostracized? So, another example for me was having a really hard time saying no to my mom. Another story that I share in the book is that my mom, for many years, would host a cookie exchange at Christmas time. And she invited my aunts and my cousins on my dad's side to come, and she would cook, and everybody would bring their cookies, and we would do this cookie exchange. I didn't want to do it. I didn't hate going, but I just didn't want to do it. It's not that I didn't enjoy my aunts and my cousins because I really did enjoy them. It's just that I didn't enjoy the tradition of baking the cookies. I didn't like to cook. I didn't like to bake. And it just felt like a lot of pressure to me. Now, you might say, well, you could have just gone without doing the cookies. And yet, that still somehow felt like I was breaking the rules or I was doing something wrong if I just showed up without the cookies. Because remember, a people pleaser is conditioned from an early age to be the good girl, to fall in line, to do what is expected to the T. And then you add perfectionism in there and you have to do it all perfectly. You can't just show up and not have cookies for the cookie exchange. So, I know this sounds crazy when I say all this out loud, but this is the kind of dialogue that can go on in our minds when we're caught in these patterns, these subconscious beliefs that are just going on and on. I went for several years, and every time I was driving over there, I could feel the pit in my stomach because I knew I was betraying myself. I was going against what I truly wanted to do. I wasn't listening to myself. I was making sure that I was making my mom happy by doing what my mom wanted me to do. And let me tell you, I was grown ass adult at this time. I was already married. I was mid to late 20s, and I was still struggling to say no. The tools again are to check in and be aware of why are you feeling so afraid? Are you afraid of being rejected? Are you afraid of being yelled at? Are you afraid of being manipulated? It's first having that awareness of what is going on in the first place. And then the other thing you can do when you start to set boundaries, especially if it's so uncomfortable for you to say no to anyone, start small. Just pick a small example of where you can say no. Start with an I statement. I am not going to come to the cookie exchange because I feel that I want to do other things with my time. I feel that I'm doing it out of guilt or pressure. You put the experience on you, you share what is in your heart and what you're actually experiencing rather than pointing a finger or blaming. And I don't want to put the blame on anyone else. I don't want to point the finger. I want to take ownership for what I'm experiencing. And no one can argue with my lived experience. So you can start out small, make sure that you're using I statements. When you start to notice physical sensations in your body when you're saying no, take a moment and breathe and be present with those feelings, just breathing through and seeing if you can offer that part of you feeling shamed, guilty, or afraid of saying no, and just giving yourself a reminder of it is okay to say no. You're entitled to say no. You're giving yourself permission to be an adult and to live your life the way that you want to live it. No one else should have authority over how you live your life. You have the God given birthright to have agency and autonomy over your life and what you want to do. And if you're afraid of the other person's response and reaction, then you just need to be with that part of yourself that is afraid and remind yourself that it's okay. Now, if this feels inaccessible because you're new to just setting boundaries, then perhaps it will be more helpful to reach out to a friend or a coach or someone that you can trust that can walk you through it in the beginning until you get more confidence and more practice at saying no and dealing with the other person's reaction, especially if it's a negative one. Because just because you're going to start to set boundaries and say no, the other does not mean that the other person will always give you the response you want. Most likely, they're not going to say, "Oh, it's totally fine. I totally get where you're coming from." Some people will, and some people do, but a lot of them are going to be so accustomed to the old dance where I said yes all the time when I wanted to say no. They're going to be used to that. And when I don't, they're going to be upset or angry. So, getting someone to help you through it in the beginning will be very helpful. What's possible is that as you start to set more boundaries with the people in your important relationships, you have the opportunity for more freedom. Everything that I write about in my book and talk about on this podcast is about doing the inner work so that we can have freedom to be our true selves. The masks that are keeping us stuck in patterns we created or developed when we were younger. And when we are living with these masks and carrying out these patterns, we end up living like a pattern rather than a life. We're not really living our true lives, being our true selves. Everything I'm talking about on this podcast. And this whole first quarter of 2025 has been focused on relationships, on how to have more meaningful relationships and more freedom within those relationships, freedom to be our true authentic selves so that they feel more meaningful. There's more connection, there's more intimacy, there's more joy between you and the people that are important in your life. This is what most of life is about. We relate to people 24/7, 365. We're always relating with other people. And so to be able to come from a place of freedom and joy and abundance with those relationships makes for a much more meaningful life. So I hope that was helpful. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed creating it for you and you're on YouTube, let me know in the comments what you thought. If you have questions, if you have thoughts about it, I would love to hear from you. I'm so grateful that you are here today listening. I hope that this helped you. And if you know of anyone else that could benefit from this particular episode, then by all means, share it with them. I will see you in the next episode.
Hey, Kim Gross here. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Masks Off for People Pleasers and Perfectionists. I invite you to hop on over to my website, kimgrosscoaching.com. Right there on the front page, there's a quiz for people pleasers and perfectionists. You can find out if you have tendencies. You can also get into my newsletter where you will be given valuable content every week on different topics I share here in the podcast. And if you really did enjoy this episode, if you found it helpful, if you found it valuable, please go to, if you're on YouTube, go and subscribe. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, then I invite you to leave a review. You can even do a star review. It doesn't have to be a written review. If you know of someone who can benefit from this podcast or this particular episode, please share it with them. I'll see you next time.